This is Penn Woods interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends. Today is September the 15th, 1971. We're at the First Baptist Church of Pawnee. I'm visiting with Mr. Floyd S. Marx, who is a longtime person from Pawnee, merchant and businessman from Pawnee, and we will talk with Mr. Marx a little about his background in Pawnee, his background in business, and his recollections about some of the people in Oklahoma that he might be able to shed a light on in the area of history. Mr. Marx, I think to begin with, why don't you tell us, give us the spelling of your name, who your parents were, and where they came from.
I'm Floyd Marx, M-A-R-X. My parents were Leon and Cecilia Marx. Both originally came from Illinois. My grandfather had a retail store in Nashville, Illinois, and my mother's folks were in Reno, Illinois, in mercantile business. So the history of the family has been mercantile. My father also had two brothers who came to Pawnee. The first was the youngest one, Gus. He came here in 1899 and he and another gentleman established a racket store, as we used to call the variety store in those days. That was, yeah, racket, R-A-C-K. And in 1900 then, my other uncle, Maurice, M-A-U-R-I-C-E, came to Oklahoma. And he and Gus opened a small department store, Gus having sold separated from the partner in the racket or variety store. Then in 1904, my father moved his store from East St. Louis, Illinois to Pawnee and incorporated the clothing department with the dry goods and made a full department store out of the stores. Well, the department store at that time was pretty much the same as it is today, except possibly they didn't have quite as many varieties. You had your piece goods and your shoes and your notions and your millinery and your ready-to-wear. And then when you got into the men's department, of course, you had your men's suits, your clothing, and your shoes. Similar departments to what you have today. At the time that we really got established as a full department store, we had some well-known names that originally, even before we came here, were originally located in Pawnee. That was the Buckley Lynch dry goods store, which was later taken over by Katz's. Lynch went to Guthrie, and Buckley, I think from the information I have had, also went to Guthrie, and then he went on into Oklahoma City and was one of the originators of the Kerr Dry Goods Company. At the same time in Pawnee, we had the Peters were here in families that had various family interests. There was the Peter Dry Goods Store, the Peter Drug Store, and the Peter Grocery Store. They were all related members of the families.
Can you think of some of the other early
Well, I mentioned that my Uncle Gus was in a partnership with someone in a racket store. Really, one of the old timers was George Soulsby, which had a truly racket store here for years. And then there was Cecil J., who had a drugstore here and was loved by everyone. And then there was A.W. Sousley. We had prior to statehood, we had open saloons here. He had one of the saloons. And then there was the Wise Brothers, W-I-S-Z, that had a saloon and a grocery store. And after her husband's death, Ms. Wise operated their grocery store for a number of years, and in late years sold it out. Then there was Pearson in the hardware and undertaking establishment in those early days. And there was coffee in the furniture store. And then there was Burrington's that came here in the early days and established a department store, and then, established a hardware store. And then Ms. Burrington's brother, Mr. Thompson, came here a few years later, and they went in the automobile business together with Burrington for a number of years. And then there was the Mensa Brothers, which had the original Ford agencies in Pawnee and operated that for years. And they also operated a hardware store. Into the back of Thompson and Burrington had the first state agency for the Ford Motor Company. I'm not sure about that. That's true. The first Ford agency? No, the state agency. State agency? Well, I've just been corrected, mentioned that Burrington Thompson had the first Ford state agency. I didn't recall that, but then that's probably true. I was 10 years old when. How don't you describe Pawnee as you first? When I first came to Pawnee, was as stated before, 1904. At that time, we had to change trains at Tulsa. And at that time, Pawnee was a larger town than Tulsa. Tulsa had just was a stopping place for a train change. The main line from St. Louis to on the Frisco went through Sapulpa, and the branch line came on through Pawnee, Enid, and Cray, and on out to Avard, which later became a big town. At that time, as I say, Pawnee was a bigger town than Tulsa. Pawnee had a population of a little in excess of 3,000. It was a county seat, of course, and still is, and it has maintained the population up and down in the proximity of 3,000 all the time. Then the town was built, as it is yet, around the courthouse on the square. And of course, instead of parking lot then, we had hitching racks. The fire department was a volunteer fire truck on the southwest corner of the square, and I helped pull the truck as a member of the volunteer department several times. And that was in the later years of my life here, prior from, I'd say from 15 to 20, 24. And well, the school system at that time that I attended was the big school located up on the hill where the present grade school is located. It was a grade and high school in a rock structure. It had classes from the first to the 12th grade. We had dedicated teachers in those days, and we had a good school system. We did have discipline. We had pranks on Halloween and things like that, but we had a dedicated school system. It's rather hard to specify those events. Probably the biggest events in the town was on various occasions we'd have Indian dances out at the edge of town, 2 or 3 or 4 miles from town in the old mud lodges, and the circus that came to town was Pawnee Bill Circus, of course, as well as other circuses, this being the home of Pawnee Bill, where he built his home in later years up on Blue Hawk Peak, which is now become a state museum under the state park system. Yes, I knew Pawnee. Well, Pawnee Bill was just a good citizen, jovial in lots of ways, always business, a friend of the Indians. Back in early days, he was a U.S. Scout, and he had the Indians circus, and it later combined with Buffalo Bill and made the Pawnee Bill, Buffalo Bill circuses, which toured the world. And then later he established this wonderful home up here on the hill overlooking the town.
He obviously had a great deal of showmanship ability.
That's right, he did have them. Well, I don't know too much to tell you about his showmanship. He is all people that like people. He made contact with various Indians, and they like to show off. They like to show off their dances, and trick riding and things of that sort. And then he had Mexican Joe with him as his foreman for a number of years, which was one of the best riders and ropers in the nation. And he kept him after he retired from the show business. He established his home. He loves people, and he loves to contact various dignitaries and had friends all over the world. He was friendly, and I think that's about all I would know to suggest about him.
Could you tell us, just a little ahead of your time, but from your knowledge, how did Pawnee begin? It began as an Indian.
Pawnee began as an Indian post, an Indian school, Indian headquarters, agency here, years back in the 60s or 70s, wasn't it? I was going to say back in the 70s, and it grew from headquarters for the Pawnee Indians. They brought the Pawnees down here on a trek from Nebraska and established them in Oklahoma.
Could you tell a little about the Indians of the time and the part the Indians played in the community as you grew into after the white people came in?
Well, of course, we had some very fine Indians here. We had Eagle Chief and Robert and the Hales.
During the period of 1900 to 1910, can you think of any particular event that was important that happened during your early years?
Well, the early events, probably previously stated, is the circus is coming to town, the Indian dancers, and the county fair, the county races. We had a racetrack here. Rodney Spinning was one of the old timers. We had a racetrack here, and we had some mighty good horse races here. We had a local band that gave concerts pretty every Saturday night. We had a good ball team, local ball team. That we'd have ball team. Huh? No, I don't know that they played. I don't know that they played Tulsa, but they'd play all these towns around here. They'd have baseball teams around Terry and Stillwater and Pahaska. We were good headquarters for it. Various Indian tribes would come in here, this agency. We had some awful good, getting way off that subject, we had some very fine lawyers that originated here in Pawnee. Congressman Bert S. McGuire, original home was here in Pawnee. No, I was much of a kid before he left. He was just a good, strong citizen. And then there was C.J. Reichman, a lawyer that become prominent throughout the state, lived here. And then the other lawyers was Judge Eagleton, Judge Biddison, and in the real estate building there was Sterling and Smith, and in the abstract business there was the Muir Abstract Company, which Molly Muir established, and they're still in business under Paul Thomas's management today. I think that pretty well covers. Well, really known except the big fire of 1907 that burned out practically the west side of the square, which is still, it went up to about the hotel or up to the grocery store. There was big 100-foot building there that was destroyed that had what at that time was the old PCH dry goods store and Weinberg's dry goods store and several other stores along this side. And it looked, I sure did, as a kid. As I say, that was in 1907, so I was 13 years old at that time, but I remember it real well. Well, I think I would say they recovered pretty quickly from it. It was rebuilt pretty fast. And
Was there any big events in 1910 and 1920? Is that right?
oh, I don't recall of anything particularly except the things that I've mentioned, like some shows coming to town and the county fairs and the races.
Were there any people who came out of Pawnee during this period that were noteworthy at all, do you know?
Well, as I mentioned, these lawyers primarily that migrated mostly to Tampa and become prominent statewide.
Tell a little about the growth of your store and the development of your department store.
Well, that the growth of our store was maybe a little slow, like all businesses. It didn't grow too fast. It started, as I suggested, with my uncle's starting the Dragon store in 1900, and my dad coming down here in 1904. And we had a 50-foot building, two 25-foot buildings to be exact. And along about 1907, the landlord that we were renting the dry goods store from told us we would have to pay more rent or move, and his rent, we thought at that time, was exorbitant, so we told him we just have to move. And in the final analysis, we moved in the clothing store to the upstairs of the building. They are occupied at that time and still occupy, and moved the dry goods store down on the main floor and operated that way for 3 or 4 years while we had a building built for us by Mr. Sousley and Mr. Yingling in the block west. The First National Bank was on the corner, and we were 25 feet away from that when we got into this new department store, which was a 50-foot building. And even moving that far location made it pretty hard. The war came along, of course, about 15. We moved up there in 1911, and business began to boom with the World War I business, and business prospered from then on. We left the clothing store in the other block, and later on, later years long in there, about 1915, I guess, we sold a third interest in the clothing store to Mr. Wheeler. And the clothing store became known as Marx Wheeler's and still operates that way today. After Mr. Wheeler passed away, his son Horace operated it, and his brother-in-law came down in later years, about 35, 38, and bought higher interest in Marx Wheeler's in 1938. And he later sold out to the son of a rancher down around Merrimack. Mr. Arnold Privet's son, Joe, bought in, and Mr. Bolt, who had worked there, bought in. So after Mr. Wheeler's son passed away, Mr. Bolt and Mr. Privet bought and today operate Marx Wheeler's, and it's still the offtake of the old Marx Brothers store. That's Rex Privet's brother Joe. Arnold Privet was the father. Armand, I guess it is really.
Were you active in any of the special Chamber of Commerce committees or other civic committees that during the 20s and 30s?
No, I wasn't in too much. I just came back here from the war in 1919, and I was out of Pawnee for a number of years, though my brother and my uncles continued to operate the store. I came back here in 45, And then is when I became active in the community, in the Chamber of Commerce and the Lions Club and the Legion. And
Tell a little about what happened in 45.
well, since 45, it's been progressive. Under good Chamber of Commerce, we have had some good men in the Chamber of Commerce. We've had some good citizens. We almost had a governor of the state of Oklahoma in Joe Ferguson, but they stole that. I was Chamber of Commerce president the year that Joe ran for governor, and had the privilege of making the short talk, which some of the Democrats didn't like, even though I was registered a Democrat as president of Chamber of Commerce. I thought I should be, and I've been active in the community life. I've always felt that if a community was worth living in, it was worth working for, and I have put in a lot of time. The Pawnee chief at that time, in 1960, long in those years, had a Citizen of the Year, and I was elected Citizen of the Year along in that. Today, I'm still, while the store has been retired, when we sold out the building for it to build the new First National Bank, which we closed out the store in 1967. And I'm still active in the Chamber of Commerce, and I'm currently am treasurer of the Chamber of Commerce.
You and make. That's all right. When you need to go, just perfectly all right. We have also in Pawnee, the date being September 15th, 1971. One of the great names in Oklahoma politics. A person who has been very active in his party. And I believe at one time, were you one time chairman of of the Republican Party? 8 years as chairman of the Republican Party. No, you were not chairman. No. But who's been quite active in the Republican Party, who's served in many political capacities, who has been involved with newspapering, and who is at one time was a candidate for the governor of the state of Oklahoma, representing his party. Yes, that was that's 7 or 8 years. But we will get all this from Mr. Ferguson. I think to start off with, let's ask you where you were born and who your parents were, Mr. Ferguson.
I was born in Willow Springs, Missouri.
Of the town, said, I want to tell you a joke on Jack Brown's institution. He was not there at the time, but he is now superintendent of what used to be the Cherokee Insane Asylum. I, with his father, were members of the Cherokee National Senate. It happened to be my duty as a member of the Board of Inspection to visit various institutions of the Cherokee tribe, inspect them, and report to the Joint Council, the Senate and the lower house. When we visited the Cherokee Insane Asylum, they first conducted us to a part of the building that was not covered with steel windows. We went to a large bedroom where there were no chairs, but there were 2 inmates visiting and sitting on the beds. One of these men was very large, and the other was a small, lightweight fellow. A large man invited his friend to stand up. He wanted to make a show to the inspectors. He ran his hands in all four pockets of this man, turned them wrong side out, turned to them and said, "Now, don't you feel sorry for him? He has no money and very little sense."
Can you think of any other personalities that you have had a close acquaintance with? Did you know Senator Robert Owen?
I was not personally acquainted with Senator Robert Owen. I've been in his presence. I had had an introduction to Senator Robert Owen by my father as his son. Robert L. Owens, though not so broadly known, was a Virginian. He was related maternally to the Mackey family. Jimmy Mackey, who was a Virginian, sent to Alabama by the colony of Virginia for the purpose of creating friendship with the Cherokee Indians located in Alabama at that time. During his residence there, he married a full-blood Cherokee woman. When it came time to make the trip to the Indian Territory, when it came time to make the trip to the Indian Territory, my grandfather brought his family and located in the state of Arkansas. At that time, considered a part of Indian Territory. The family located there because the soil was picturesque of that of the vicinity from which they were excluded. Game was plentiful, the soil was rich. There come a time when the inhabitants of Arkansas considered that that was a part of their land, that the Cherokees had not moved far enough. A survey was ordered by the Executive Department of Washington. After the survey was determined as it now exists, a number of Cherokees had to come farther west. On his way to his new home, grandfather learned by the Fort Smith, Arkansas Gazette, I believe, which is now published.
That'd be letter, I can do it with you.
I think so.
Yeah.
That there was a salt works 11 miles from the mouth, from the Arkansas River, starting at the mouth of Illinois River. Grandfather purchased and operated this salt work, which is now submerged by Lake Tenkiller. Not knowing all the details of its location, it is my privilege to pass through Cookson, Oklahoma, from Sallisaw, Oklahoma, riding a large horse and taking a small pony to W. Hastings, then a member of United States Congress at Tulsa. In going down a steep hill to the side of Illinois River, which had to be crossed later, I asked the student of mine who was carrying the mail at that time from Vian to Cookson, Oklahoma, what those large carved sandstones were there by the side of the road. His reply was that some of the old folks told me that that is a part of the foundation of the Mackay Salt Works. I said, Dick, to my surprise, I'm concluding that that belonged to my grandfather. At home, where I was residing with an aunt, there was in the upper part of the hay story of their house a trunk constructed of tin, not ventilated like some of the old-time cabinets or safes of the kitchen. This little trunk was loaded with Confederate money, still in bundles of certain denominations. My aunt used to permit us to use a bundle of that to play with in our store in the attic part of the house. The Mackay Salt Works were located on the United States Military Road from Fort Smith to Texas. A lot of fuel was necessary for the 100 or more cast iron kettles used for evaporating salt, which was piped from the bed of the Illinois River through a large stone, through a large granite layer of rock, where they had succeeded in driving the pipe just down into the rock and forcing the water up onto the salt water up onto the bank of the river. Just a little previous to the Civil War, Grandfather sold his salt works to a merchant living here in Tahlequah. His family name was Wilson. But during the Civil War, Grandfather was too old to be inducted into the Confederate Army, and he knew that there was still a surplus of the salt at the works where he had buildings that were comparable at that time to what we call now our highway hotels to accommodate automobiles. He accommodated covered wagons, hacks, and buggies, and these people stayed all night, lots of times with him, and for a nominal charge, enjoyed lodging and meals. During the war, and after he had moved from the works, he concluded that he could do his part for the North and the South by hauling salt by way of ox wagon to the northern soldiers, to the Cherokee Northern sympathizers at Fort Scott, Kansas, where he derived in the neighborhood of $29 a bushel for his salt. He also hauled his salt to the South sympathizers near Idabel, Oklahoma, at a place called Fort Towson at that time, which was under the control of the Confederate Army. There he obtained $32 in Confederate money for his salt.
What was your principal career after you, was it teaching after those early years?
When the Cherokee Male Seminary burned March the 20th, 1910, it is necessary that I find another job. This was the week before Easter that year. I concluded it was advisable that I go over to Muskogee and visit Father during the weekend and probably obtain a suit of clothes and maybe a shirt or two for Easter Sunday. The train arrived back at Tahlequah about 7 o'clock. It was on time. I don't know how the depot agent's wife realized that I would be on the train, but she happened to know that and grabbed me by the hand, saying, "Jack, if you want to see the remains of your old home for the last time, you better come to the end of the platform." When we got there, the roof was falling in. The next day, That day, we visited the school as near as we could because of the heat. We returned the next day and several pictures were taken before the columns and the walls were knocked down for safety. About April the 1st, I enrolled in Northeastern State Normal, which is now Northeastern State College. I completed the summer term. There was a vacancy as a teacher in the 5th grade at Stillwell, Oklahoma. I had never had any public school training and not too much teacher training. But a $60 per month job was available. I accepted it. I stayed at a hotel in Stillwell known as the Lee Hotel. I saved the greater part of this $60. As soon as a friend of the family and a Cherokee found that I was going to teach in Stillwell, he said, "How'd you like to work for me after school, maybe sometimes kind of late at night?" I said, "What doing?" He said, "Oh, I am county clerk here." At that time, there was no assessment office. The county clerk made the tax rolls. I said, "I'd be glad to try it if you tell me what I'm to do." During that time, I worked in his office. The county clerk's office was closed on Saturday. On Saturday, I worked in a gents' clothing store. The funds from these two projects paid my room and board at the hotel, where I enjoyed staying very much and where I enjoyed teaching. At the end of the year, Gay B. Parker, a Choctaw, was superintendent of Armstrong Academy, a school for Choctaw males.
We're at the end of this tape, and I think we'll take a little break and then
About the time that the period was drawing near for the end of the 1910-1911 school year at Stillwell, Oklahoma, information came to me through some of my instructors at Okla that there was a vacancy as principal teacher at Armstrong Academy, a Choctaw boys' school, for a capacity of about 135 enrollment. The superintendent of the school at that time was Gabe E. Parker, a Choctaw, a graduate of some of the Choctaw tribal schools, and also a graduate of Henry Kendall College, which is now Tulsa, Oklahoma, Tulsa College, University of Tulsa. Mr. Parker's problem and need at that time was the employment of someone who could take the place of his principal, who felt it necessary to enroll at Stillwater Agricultural College, now Oklahoma State University. My need for employment was real, and I appreciated the fact that probably I could satisfy Mr. Parker on his requirements for supervision of military drill. This might be considered one of the extracurricular activities at the old Cherokee Male Seminary, destroyed by fire. The salary was $40 more than I was getting at Stillwell, so I immediately accepted. My duties there was principal teacher, instructor of the 7th and 8th grade, I was responsible for discipline. In addition, was responsible for military drill, which began at sometimes before breakfast, and if the weather was better, we drilled an hour or so after breakfast. In addition to that, I had supervision of the boys' bathing. I conducted chapel exercise. I supervised the shop and had numerous other duties about the building. I was quartered in the main building, which at one time was the capital of the Choctaw Nation. Armstrong Academy was located, as was the Mackey Salt Works, directly on the military road from Fort Smith, Arkansas to the forts in Texas. I learned at one time that Armstrong Academy was quite a settlement, that there were stores adjoining the place. There was a post office there, but during the time that I was working there, Choctaw Tribal Affairs had been moved to other locations in the nation, so that this place served entirely as a boys' school. Besides the academic work, which also included a manual training shop as designated at that time. Our shopman or instructor was from Muskegon, Michigan. He'd had considerable experience in football and was made coach of the Armstrong Academy team. J.B. Parker was very enthusiastic in athletics. He had experienced every phase of it in Kendall College and in the Choctaw schools, and he thought his boys ought to be versed in that and the military training as had been taught before by experienced soldiers. The man whom I superseded was a sergeant, had been a sergeant in the United States Army. Mr. Parker really thought that probably I should have come up to his action. There was only one difference in the military training at Armstrong Academy and the old male seminary where I was captain of Company B. My brother was captain of Company C, and a classmate by the name of Martin T. was captain of Company A. At the end of school at Armstrong Academy, it was customary to have a drilling contest. There were judges who simply stood on the grounds and observed the contest, which began with the 3 companies of the battalion. This contest was conducted at the end of the school, generally at the close of May or the opening of the June month. A student was on a bound when making a mistake in his drill to drop out without the judges call his attention to it. And in very few cases, it was never necessary for a judge to point out the man who had made an error. During the time that I was there and before, these contests would last from noon, sometimes until even after the supper time. Supper was delayed because a boy had not made an error in his drilling. This was very exhausting, but it is one activity that they took as much interest in as in football or baseball. In football, our boys at Armstrong remembered that they had played the old Cherokee Male Seminary and Jones Academy at Hartshorn, Oklahoma, and recalled that the games were very tight games. I had an experience that was unusual at Armstrong. In my enrollment at the Cherokee Male Seminary, I only took part in class football. I never played baseball, except as a pastime with a glove and catching. My brother, though, younger brother, was an active football player. He was the lightest guy on the team, played tackle next to a guard that weighed 220 pounds. John weighed approximately 135 or 40 pounds. He was exceptionally strong, agile, very quick, and had no fears of contact in football. He did experience one time having his arm broken above the wrist. The school physician, Dr. Charles Ross, who was related to the Brown family, took pride in attending John, who was rather jokeful. He realized what he was doing all the time and kind of wanted to tease the doctor. But the doctor said, "Now, John, if you don't use that arm, I'm going to put it in a cast. We don't want you to have a stiff arm." Well, one of the most difficult assignments that I had at Armstrong Academy was discipline. All teachers and employees at the academy were responsible in reporting breach of conduct to the principal. It was the principal's duty at recess time every morning to adjust that discipline report. And it was by the hickory switch, not as it was used, but in a very mild way, and lots of times it obtained its effect. I only had one experience that by luck avoided injury. One of the boys on the football team that I had played with when Superintendent Parker advised us that Southeastern State Normal at Durant would like for us to come over and scrimmage with their team. They had adequate scrimmage material, but they wanted to play some Indian boys. The boys on the team said, "Well, we don't want to scrimmage them. They're so much heavier now. We are. They've had more experience than we have." But after Mr. Parker had talked to them a long time, assured them that they owed it to the Normal, said, "Well, if the principal and the shop man will play with us on the team, we'll scrimmage them." They issued us uniforms. I succeeded in getting an old pair of shoes on that had been used I don't know how long. I recall that the cleats were very hard on the bottom of my feet. But one experience in that was that for some reason or another, I got rid of corns and bunions. But in the scrimmage in Durant, the first down, I found out that my right hand was partially injured when somebody fell on it. For quite a while I couldn't shake hands with anyone. I was playing right end, and to my surprise, when we lined up, who was facing me but one of the best players on the Cherokee Male Seminary, a young